I'm Nils Bühler. I'm a PhD student in Cologne, and I'm really glad to be here. The call for papers for this year's Frog addressed the interplay between freedom, oppression, games, and play. And in regards to German history, this is coincidentally what my PhD project is all about. And I thought that this conference today gives me the perfect opportunity to talk about something that I have been thinking about for quite some time. For my dissertation, I examined the relationship between the German states of the 20th century and mechanical and digital games, that is mostly early coin-operated arcade machines and the early digital games of the 1980s. And since I use a discourse analysis approach, my research is mostly critical of the processes in the institutions responsible for game control. And I think it's the right way to go about this. But critique is more often than not a rather destructive undertaking, which is, of course, very rightfully so. But I thought that today, with all kinds of experts on freedom and oppression in games present here today, I thought that it might be time to take a look at the more productive side of this critical approach. So I want to present some thoughts on ethical game regulation, which are a work in early progress. And I don't want to offer solutions, but I hope that my talk will lead to some discussions maybe later or overall, which I think are absolutely necessary. Where do I switch the slides? Okay. Right, okay. So I will start with a few aspects of my research to give you an idea of what my thoughts are based on, to then point out a few problems and questions that I think are relevant, to end with some thoughts on the ethics of game regulation. Most of my talk will focus on the situation in Germany, but the issue I raise also apply elsewhere, as we've certainly seen with the last talk of Nikita. All right, I will start with my academic comfort zone, which is the history of game regulation in Germany. I will focus on the regulation of these kinds of games here today. Which are early digital games for home use in West Germany. Most of them ran on Commodore 64 computers, which were first available in West Germany in 1983. And very soon, a whole number of different games followed, distributed both legally and illegally, and often developed independently by the young gamers themselves. They were accompanied by moral panic, and it took only months for the authorities in Germany to take concern. In 1984, the Bundesprüfstelle für jugendgefährdende Schriften, BPJS, which is the Federal Review Board of Youth Corrupting Publications, started to put games on the so-called index. Media on this list cannot be sold to minors, cannot be offered in shops accessible to minors, and cannot be advertised. Maybe unsurprisingly, the BPJS has often been called a censorship authority from its very beginning, as for example, here in Satire magazine. Censorship, however, is a problematic term since it ascribes rather than describes, as Frederick Schauer aptly notes. Someone who restricts or prohibits an instance of communication would nowadays hardly call themselves a censor. But someone on the producing or receiving end will call all intervention viewed as unjustified censorship. To put it plainly, censorship accusations are used to ascribe immorality to media control practices. In some cases, certainly rightfully so, but for analytic purposes, I prefer the term media control, which is more neutral. The BPJS has always been a good example of how perspective matters when it comes to media control ethics. In the parliamentary debate leading up to this, to its instatement, indexing was seen as a necessary evil to save the moral integrity of the young generation. Its purpose was to shield the youth from all corrupting influences as long as their social surroundings were still unstable in the war aftermath. What this generation needed to be shielded from was subject to fierce discussion. Interestingly enough, though, no party actually demanded to discard the idea of controlling books and journals altogether. The parliament quarreled about means, goals, actors, and the terms, and were not reluctant to throw around accusations of censorship, but the general need to control publication was accepted by all speakers. What was called censorship and what justified action against immoral content was a matter of perspective, and it still is. In the 1980s, the C64 was the hot new thing, and action games like River Raid, Barbarian, Highlander, and the like, which you've already seen here, were immensely popular. Pixelated Nakedness had its first appearances, and a lot less popular, but unfortunately existing, games that glorified World War II and the Holocaust, dubbed Nazisware, were circulated. The PPJS was invoked to deal with these games, and did so in 133 cases in the 1980s alone, most of which because of depictions of violence. River Raid, Barbarian, Highlander, and Raid over Moscow were among them. The way the BPJS operated was far from unproblematic. Its decisions were mostly based on stereotypes, supported by biased and methodologically weak research. A diffuse fear of a de-emotionalizing effect of computer games in general, coupled with the conviction of a causative relationship between media content and user behavior, led the hands of the BPJS. To just quote one very notorious passage, the computer game Beachhead has aggression-increasing properties. In older adolescents, playing Beachhead leads to physical cramps, anger, aggressiveness, mental slowness, difficulty concentrating, headaches, and others. Since apart from the command-obedience relationship, no differentiated social rules are offered for coping with anger and feelings of destruction, it can be assumed that any tendencies to aggression that may arise cannot be adequately controlled, even in non-game situations. End quote. The view that game content would directly cause effects in the behavior of players has since been refuted and was very much debated in the early 1980s already. As Herbert Selk, himself very critical of digital games, wrote in 1983, there is no dominant view on this topic amongst pedagogues, psychologists, or medical doctors. Some things are presented as proven, which are at best a plausible assumption. End quote. The fear that fueled the BPJS's decisions was that the interactive nature of games was even more dangerous than the already daunting, violent, and sexual content on TV and video. Play was seen as more persuasive than mere perception, with this persuasion happening less noticeable, they feared. Shortly after, in 1985, digital games were banished from public spaces to arcades only, accessible to adults, and the first games made appearances before the courts. In my dissertation, I examined the epistemology of media control related to games. So how the knowledge these authorities acted on, how they came to be. I don't have time to go into more detail in regards to my research, but I thought it would be helpful to understand the backdrop of my thoughts on this topic, to give a little bit of insight. This backdrop is relevant because the general necessity to control media is a very topical subject. The ideal of an absolute freedom of speech finds its limits in mobbing, hate, discrimination, warmongering, fake news, and fake history, as the discussion around Elon Musk's takeover over Twitter has aptly shown. The major playing field of these kinds of divisive practices is social media, but game regulation should not be ignored. Firstly, because games are very much under regulation, albeit this regulation is more widely accepted than in the 1980s in Germany. And secondly, to not leave these considerations to those that might not have the most nuanced view on gaming. And this has been the case not so long. German authorities' means of game regulation are relatively extensive. The BPJS now is called BPGM and is part of the bigger Center for Youth Protection, but its principles and practices have remained quite stable. Courts can prohibit certain games completely if they glorify violence or war, incite violence, or exhibit racial hate. Also, the self-monitoring agency of the entertainment software industry, USK, founded in 1994, has the mandate to declare legally binding age restrictions. With the founding of the USK, the gaming industry itself was put in charge of most of the regulatory action, which provided the publishers more security, being applied before market release rather than after. Gaming communities have been very critical in the past of all of the mentioned authorities, although that has somewhat changed since the latter abandoned their harsh sentencing practices at about 2015, as Jan Husemann has shown in his dissertation, which you can see here. They finally abandoned some stances seen as oppressive by many, admitting that games can indeed have a commentary function, which awarded games a status close to art, which is exempt from most regulation in Germany. These changes in practice were not the result of a thorough reform. The according laws are open to interpretation and provide the authorities a lot of leeway. The appointment of the boards remains opaque and problematic. For the BPGM, experts are elected out of a pool of nominees of stakeholder associations of the creative industries, pedagogy, and religion, as well as representatives of the German states. I think I included, yeah, okay, you don't have to read all of that, of course. The USK has a very similar pool of candidates. A common defense of this composition is that the boards of the BPGM and USK are pluralistic. This pluralism is, however, based on political, moral, or epistemic power. The BPJM, the criminal courts, and the USK are all part of constitutional and, in fact, democratically legitimized media control system. Yet this doesn't mean that they are up to the challenges of our postmodern and digital age or can be considered ethically sound, not even if one were to consider its current practice right. This is what I want to discuss for the remaining minutes of my talk. With people being increasingly wary of single moral instances telling them what to do and what not to do, institutions like the BPJM fall out of time. And with authoritarian tendencies on the rise, a few more fail-safes against abuse of power wouldn't hurt. Media regulation in Germany is based on the principle of negotiated liberty, vermittelte Freiheit, as Ernst Wolfgang Büttenförder calls it. Negotiated liberty is a compromise between subjective and objective liberty. In English, the terms negative and positive liberty, I think, are more prevalent, but both kinds of terminology are somewhat ambiguous, so I just stick to Büttenförder. Subjective liberty means that law is merely the limitation of the freedom of the individual, and that this limitation is supposed to be as small as possible, the libertarian ideal of freedom. Objective liberties, on the other hand, are collectively binding moral standards. They ensure common values of a community and facilitate the pursuit of common goals. Objective liberties can be roughly understood as the ideals of more authoritative political models. Büttenförder understands these kinds of liberties as extremes that both lead to conflict. Subjective liberty can privilege already privileged individuals and is based on arbitrariness. Objective liberty can oppress the individual and privileges the state. Negotiated liberty walks the thin line between these extremes. According to Büttenförder, this concept is the basis of the German constitution and of any liberal democracy, although the negotiation might be balanced differently, and in this extension of German media regulation. Freedom of speech and information in the German constitution has limits in common law, youth protection, and personal dignity. These exceptions need to be negotiated. And this negotiation is carried out by the courts, the BPJM, and as subsidiary to the state by the USK. The idea is that subjective freedom is granted as long as certain collectively agreed limits are not violated. In theory, the current means of game regulation fit this idea. Communication, for the most part, remains free. Only when the mentioned collectively set boundaries are infringed, the state intervenes. Outside the law perspective, I think this terminology is not as fitting. The negotiation of the freedom of communication takes place behind closed doors, for the most part, which can amplify mistrust. It also manifests power structures, since groups that already are in privileged positions provide the actors. And most importantly, there is no actual negotiation except within the authorities themselves. Where game regulation is to be situated on this chart here is in the hands of the actors within these authorities. There is, of course, no magic bullet. Controlling communication always is problematic, and it should be. To walk the thin ethical line of media regulation between oppression and facilitating of freedom, game regulation needs to be an open, participatory process, I argue. To quote Schauer, censorship is inevitable, necessary, and desirable, but it is less inevitable, necessary, or desirable that this group rather than that group do it. I already laid out my reasons for not using the term censorship, but substituted with media control, I think this statement is really useful as a way to summarize what I've said and to lay out the requirements for ethical media control. Let's go through it step by step. Media control is inevitable since communication is always controlled by authorities, by commentary, by different kinds of capital, by societal norms. Media control is necessary since it provides an objective counterweight to the subjective liberties of the individual, as well as a form of community. Media control is desirable because it ensures these limits to societal corrosion. The second part of the quote addresses the issue of who has the authority to make these concessions. And I think that this is the key to finding a good way for game regulation to be a means of facilitating freedom rather than being a means of oppression. One solution, of course, would be to discard off regulation altogether. It's a compelling solution, promising the absence of power structures. No authority, no control, no ethical dilemma. But critical theory has taught us, and the recent Twitter hate spiral has reminded us, that there is no absence of power and that less regulation does not equal less inequality, violence, abuse, etc. Unregulated, or at least unchecked media, tend to be dominated by already dominant or plainly loud positions in the discourse. Many European countries employ the PEGI system. PEGI provides age recommendations and content labels. Both are first issued by the publisher and then tested by a board. PEGI is a prime example of a liberal solution. It informs and lets the user or their legal guardians decide. For most intents and purposes, this solution is a very practical one. Still, there are some issues. For most, one is that only publishers that join PEGI get the rating, although the pressure to join is quite high, given that a PEGI rating is mandatory for market access in some countries. PEGI is also not controlled publicly, and its workings remain rather opaque. This is why I think that even this well-established and very liberal approach should be seen as problematic. I argue for more engagement with the public, with the users that will play the games eventually, before any bans or restrictions are applied. The main question is how a society can agree on common values while acknowledging that they are products of historical and societal context. The German Constitution, for example, is very much based on Christian social ethics, although it is mostly secular. It is based in metaphysics. Even if the center of value has somewhat changed over the years, every law and every court verdict is ultimately justified by it. The question is now how law, authority, and the state itself can find legitimacy if this very basis is challenged, and how politics can be made more participatory. And the same goes for media regulation. For issues like this, political philosophy suggests a number of solutions. They mostly apply to the composition of parliaments or similar decision-making bodies, but I think some are also applicable here. I don't have the time to go through them in detail, but as I said in the beginning, I merely want to spark a debate and not posit solutions. Brigitte Geisel just recently published this handbook for communities to find their own ways of governing, and it also provides a good overview of the kinds of models and visions of different kinds of democracy. Her view is that each of these visions are fine as long as the community chooses and accepts them. My point today here is that each of them are worth to be considered, not only for decision-making as a whole, but for game regulation in particular. They mostly deal with three issues: how to constitute a decision-making body, what this decision body looks like, and how to reach a decision within that. What a decision body could look like is, for example, addressed with so-called mini-publics, small groups of people that are supposed to represent a population. The appointment process is subject to a lot of debate. Some argue for a lotocratic appointment, letting chance decide. Others try to include as many demographic groups as possible, and so on. Another approach is direct democracy, as it is practiced in Switzerland, for example. The second issue, forming a decision, is, for example, suggested to be based on deliberation and agreement, or on mere majorities. One of the concepts are deliberative mini-publics, abbreviated as DMPs. Members are selected randomly out of the whole population or following a stratified formula, are then informed in the subject matter, for example, by experts that are also available for Q&A, and then discuss the subject at hand to finally form a decision. The concepts differ in how far their proposed bodies influence the actual political decision. Many recommend to instate some sort of citizens' advisory board, which deliberates over an issue to then give their recommendation on policy to a legislative body. Others turn that process around. Politicians provide policy options, and the citizens decide which will be enacted. There are many different concepts, and they all have their pros and cons. What I hope is that game regulation can become a subject of productive discussion after the toxic debate around so-called killer games has finally subsided. Because I think people should concern themselves with the limits of play in lieu of the many problems gaming communities face. With this very brief view into possible models for a more democratic approach to game regulation, I close my talk. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to the debate.